I have very unfair competition up there, and I'll try my best to talk about education. But before I begin with education, I think it's good to have a sense of what Krishnamurti was talking about life in general, about humanity, and how that connects with education. It doesn't need a Krishnamurti to tell us that there's great disorder in the world, a great deal of violence, tremendous inequality, constant sense of anxiety amongst people about their security, jobs. You turn on the television and you see pictures of children being dragged out from bombed out cities, children dying of cholera, all kinds of violence we seem to heap on ourselves. Either we accept that as part of the natural order and carry on as best we can, or one can begin to question why this happens. In that questioning, one can probably come across many explanations. One could blame politicians. One could blame social and political systems. One could blame technology. Karl Marx would have blamed the economic system, and so on. But Krishnamurti pointed out that really the disorder is much more fundamental. It's not really some kind of outward disorder which a certain amount of careful thinking can set right. But there's a deeper cause of this disorder, and he pointed out, to me at least convincingly, that the disorder in the human consciousness creates the disorder in society, in the world as a whole. So, the disorder outside is not independent of what we are as human beings. He makes one more point, that human consciousness is one. It's not that there are separate individuals and somehow each of their separate consciousnesses added together in some abstract way can be called the human consciousness. He's saying, really, our brains respond to this collective human consciousness. Just like language is a collective phenomenon, each of us contributing to and participating in the language. Similarly, we contribute to what could be called the human consciousness and participate in this human consciousness. And this consciousness has within it movements of violence, fear, desire, and a peculiar quality of feeling that each human being is psychologically separate from other human beings. Right? Even in our closest relationships, there's a sense of separation, a sense of being psychologically separate from the other. And further, there's not only a sense of me being psychologically separate from you, us being psychologically separate from them, our group being psychologically separate from other groups. But even within myself, there's a strange quality of psychological separation as me and my experiences. Right? I think each one of us probably can relate to this. Again, most of us, when we grow up, we take for granted this psychological separation because we absorb it from the environment in which we are born. Every one of our structures reflect this psychological separation. So like a child who absorbs a language, we absorb the language of psychological separation and begin to take it for granted that it's the most natural thing. We also take it for granted that the feeling of me as separate from my experiences. Also, we assume that that is a fact of life, that is so. However, perhaps destabilizing, however difficult to be with that fact is there. I don't think I would have ever had the capacity to explore whether this is really so. So it needed, for someone like me, Krishnamurti to point out that that may not be a fact, that this feeling of psychological separation, though it is there, may be a construct of thought, may be constructed and sustained by thought, something that exists as long as thought is actively supporting it and sustaining it, something that comes to an end when thought is no longer supporting it and sustaining it. We see many such examples. If I consider you my enemy, my thought has to sustain the feeling that you are my enemy. As long as my thought sustains the feeling that you are my enemy, I consider you my enemy and function accordingly. If it stops sustaining that idea, that opinion that you are my enemy, you are no longer my enemy. Right? So, it seems to me a tremendous discovery to find out that this psychological division, which we take for granted and which we assume is something inherent in nature, is not really so, that it's something that needs to be sustained by the activity of thought. And the question arises then, is it possible to free the mind of this activity of division and separation? One might ask, why should it be done? Why not just live with that situation? But I would like to suggest that the deepest source of disorder is this feeling of psychological separation. That in this feeling of psychological separation, there comes the possibility that you might be a threat to me, that your group might be a threat to my group. So there is immediately a need to create boundaries and protect these boundaries. In the creation of these boundaries and the protection of these boundaries, there is inevitably going to be conflict and violence. So the other person's misery seems somewhat distant, somewhat removed from my existence. And so I can tolerate it. If a child in Yemen dies of cholera because of the fighting, I don't mind tolerating it. Only when it comes very close to my house, then I begin to be disturbed. So this feeling of psychological separation and division creates a profound lack of empathy, a profound lack of relationship between human beings. Therefore, without addressing this question of psychological separation and seeing whether it can be ended, Krishnamurti said that you can never end human disorder. You can never end the disorder that is created by mankind when there is a functioning from this feeling of separation. I can understand that because every so-called leader has this sense of division and separation embedded within him. So when he functions, however wanting to do something good, because the action is coming from a sense of division, inevitably it sustains the disorder that comes from division. And quite often, people who become leaders exploit this sense of division. They find it convenient to be able to use it to come to power. So it's a really extraordinarily important question that human beings have to examine and address. Unfortunately, we don't seem to be very interested in this question. We take it for granted that the individual can do nothing, and therefore this activity of disorder has to go on. If you look at it, you cannot end violence through violence. You cannot end division through the activity of division. You have to bring a different approach to it altogether. And whether it is in a school, or whether it is Krishnamurti talking to the public, or dialogues that he had with people, educating the mind, educating not merely in terms of giving it some concepts and ideas, but bringing the capacity for the mind to examine its own activity and its own movement. I would call that education. So education seems to be the only non-divisive, non-violent action. Hence, it seems to me very logical that if you're really concerned about addressing this disorder, however small that action seems, you have to start with education. You have to start with creating the capacity to question this activity of thought which sustains and creates division. Therefore, for me, it seemed very, very simple to say that if I'm really concerned with human situation, education is where one starts with. And so I think I have tried to explain why I feel education is a logical starting point to address this movement of human disorder. Now one could ask, what kind of education? Right. As we know, most education is concerned with the development of the intellect. Just yesterday, the Rinpoche, he gave a searing indictment of modern education. He said, the only function of education seems to be to create people who are producers and consumers, so that the economic activity can go on and go on expanding, regardless of what happens to the earth and regardless of how this activity can be destructive to mankind itself. So there is one kind of education which is primarily concerned with the capacity of the intellect and the development of the intellect. And quite often we feel that what could be called moral education also is the creation of a set of values and imparting those values as information to human beings, to children. But again, there may be a very different approach to education, not merely the development of the intellect, but the bringing about a capacity to examine the activity of thought, to bring about a capacity in children not to take for granted this separative activity of thought, not to indoctrinate them and somehow get them to feel trained into some kind of submissive acceptance or submissive acceptance of an idea that we are all one. That doesn't work, because the deeper movement is a feeling of separation. The deeper movement always overwhelms whatever training you can give to the mind on the surface. But there may be a possibility of the adult, the teacher, the parent, and the child actually learning the art of examining the activity of thought as it happens within themselves, as it happens between them and their friend, as it happens in the school environment. And it seems to me that it's very obvious that this education, this capacity to observe the movement of thought and what it does, is as natural and as important as the capacity to learn mathematics or to learn physics or whatever. I would suggest that in fact, without bringing about this capacity, we are betraying our children. We are condemning them to a life of anxiety, which inevitably comes about when this feeling of separation is not examined. Anxiety in relationships, emotions that come from this feeling of separation, all that, we are happy to condemn to this because we take it for granted that's natural. But when you begin to question it, when you begin to ask yourself, is that really so? Is it really possible to awaken the mind to this activity of thought? Then you begin to find out that in fact, in a school, you can do a great deal. It's not difficult in bringing up children to also bring up a capacity within them, even from a very young age, from the age of 4, 5, because it's not an intellectual examination. It's a simple, natural act of observing. And children, in fact, are very, very good observers. They're very observant of everything. But we never ask them to observe the activity of thought. All of the time, the observing is happening outwardly. I'm not saying that the outward observation is not necessary. It's absolutely necessary to be able to look at the flower, to be able to look at the tree, to be able to look at the sky and the cloud. But equally, it's possible to get the child to observe the activity of thought as it is happening within him. And when you begin to do that, from a very young age, a different quality can come into being in the child. So, is it possible? I would say it is possible. My quest as an educator for the last 40 odd years has been to see what kind of environment, what kind of bringing together of people will allow for such an exploration to happen. It might seem that in the modern world, not very many people are very interested in this kind of a question, because the pressure to find security through a job or to find security through some kind of a skill seems so strong that very few of us really look at education in a different way. But fortunately, there are adults who want something different for their children. They may not be very clear what they're looking for, but when you begin to suggest that there's a totally different kind of education possible, people begin to respond to that. People begin to say, yes, I would like to see if that can happen to my child. It's very, very hard work. Right? It's one thing to get a sense that the activity of thought creates the feeling of separation, but that alone is not sufficient. You have to work really hard to find out, to really be alert to this activity of thought, to become extraordinarily sensitive to this whole movement. Unfortunately, very often we impose these structures of thought onto our children. Knowingly, unknowingly, they absorb the way we act, they absorb the way we create division, and we impose it on them, because for us, that's the only way we function. But if we begin to engage together, the adults, that's the teachers and the parents, and we begin to ask ourselves whether it is possible to really examine within ourselves our own emotions, our own fears, our own conflicts. In that very alertness, in that very engagement with that question, we begin to get the capacity to be able to communicate that with the children in not merely as ideas, not merely as opinions, but in a very direct and simple way. And that kind of an education might help that human being to be free of this extraordinary curse of feeling separate psychologically. Now, as I said, right now, there aren't very many people who are interested in such an education. Most people look for economic security, and what we call education is primarily to provide that kind of economic security, whichever strata of society you are in. So depending upon the particular strata of society, you are satisfied with an education which gives some economic security, or you want a much higher level of economic security, so you look for an education which provides that. But it's possible to start with a small group. And I think if there are some schools, even if there are only a few who are engaged with these questions, they have a way of creating an environment where other people begin to ask these questions. Other people who are interested in education come and say, if you can do it, perhaps I can do it too. So it's very, very important, it seems to me, that there are at least a few schools who are asking these questions. I wouldn't therefore worry about success. I wouldn't worry about numbers. I wouldn't worry about whether this can ever spread to larger numbers. I think doing something like this with great intensity has its own effect on society and the environment. And therefore, it's worth doing it. It requires, as I said, a great deal of cooperation between the adults. So the way you set up the school, the way you invite teachers, the way you invite parents to come and have this education for their children, you have to take great care in all that. If one is not doing that, it's very easy to slip into a situation where primarily the education is for the intellect, and one tries to bring this in to a greater or lesser degree depending upon what the environment allows you. But if you're really, really concerned, it does seem to me that there are people out there who have some kind of economic security, who are saying, I want something else for my child. I'd like to see if really my child has a stability, a deep, profound stability, which comes not merely from living in a happy environment, but which has a deeper quality because one has begun to really understand the nature, the way thought works, what it does, what its effects are, and whether the mind can be free of that. Krishnaji used to talk of two kinds of learning. One is an accumulative learning, where you're learning skills, where you're learning ideas, opinions, all kinds of things. He used to constantly ask, is there a learning which is not accumulative, which is not really the development of skills? And it seems to me that the word learning, unfortunately, has got too narrowed down. It's got narrowed down primarily to the accumulation of skills and knowledge. So the minute one uses the word learning, immediately the mind goes to the idea that at the end of it, there must be a set of knowledge and a skill set and a knowledge set, and that can be examined, and that can be measured, and that's what learning is all about. But there may be a very, very different movement of learning, which is really a kind of the brain becoming extraordinarily sensitive, the brain becoming extraordinarily alert to the movement of thought, to the habits and patterns that thought creates. And in that very attention and sensitivity to the activity of thought, there's a certain kind of freedom. Because we are functioning mechanically. Most of the time, we function very, very mechanically. Whatever reactions we have accumulated, those reactions impose on us certain kinds of reactions, certain kinds of behavior, right? So I accumulate a whole lot of reactions, and these reactions come out in all my relationships. And there's an identification with these reactions. There's a feeling that this is me, and that makes it very difficult to really see if reactions can end, because these beliefs, these ideas, these reactions constitute me So it becomes an existential crisis if I have to let go of all this. But if the mind begins to see that this activity of thought brings about tremendous insecurity, it brings about insecurity not only in the individual but in society as a whole, the very perception of that danger, I think, allows for a different movement of learning to happen. A movement of learning which is primarily a sensitivity, a profound alertness and an awakened quality where you're watching the activity of thought, and because there is that capacity to watch the activity of thought, the brain doesn't get identified with it and move along with that. So it seems that from quite a young age, it's possible to bring about this kind of education. We take it for granted that perhaps children are too young and you can't really explain all these things to them, and therefore you need for them to get older. But that's because, again, we function from and we depend on the intellect. But if we allow the other capacities of the brain, the capacity to observe, the capacity to look, the capacity to listen, the capacity to be attentive, we don't really give these capacities the importance that they should have in the bringing up of children. When we do that, you begin to find that, as I said, from very young age, you can communicate to the children in a very direct way what is happening, what kind of reactions are taking place, what kinds of reactions are accumulating. And that's all one needs to do, I feel. You don't need then to try and do something to control these reactions. You don't need to try and somehow train the mind not to have these reactions. The very alertness, the very act of being awake to these reactions brings its own order. So, is it possible for this to be the primary concern of education, and in this being the primary concern of education, also to see that the child needs skills, the child needs a certain amount of knowledge. So I start from there and do this. I start from seeing whether the education is about awakening, attention, alertness, a certain kind of awakened state. And from there, I begin to see what kinds of skills, what kind of knowledge, and so on. But if I start from here and hope somehow to achieve that, I don't think that happens. If the adults, if the teachers, if the parents are interested, it seems to me that this kind of education is as possible as the other kind of education. I said that we take it for granted that the intellect is the primary instrument that the brain has. And we give it primacy. In every act of looking, in every act of listening, the intellect immediately comes and labels something. The intellect immediately comes and tries to categorize something. So we really don't look completely. We don't listen completely. Right? And therefore, all the time, our understanding, what we call understanding, is guided by the intellect. The intellect creates an idea about something and then uses that idea to observe what is happening. We are all used to that, and that kind of analytical inquiry is very important and necessary if you have to create science, if you have to do mathematics. Excuse me, I'll have a little water. But I'd like to suggest that there's a very different kind of inquiry which could be called a meditative inquiry. Those are my words, they are not Krishnaji's words. But somehow, I want to make a distinction between the kind of inquiry that we normally have, which is an analytical kind of inquiry. There may be a different kind of inquiry where you are just observing, not creating an idea, not creating a model, just observing what is happening, and that might have a penetrative quality which is far greater than the kind of inquiry we are used to. Take, for example, an emotion like anger. My analytical inquiry might say, well, I'm angry because of this, or I'm angry because this person should not have behaved that way, or I feel deeply threatened by the behavior of that person, and I feel justified in my anger because that person had no right to do this or that, and so on. Right? Now that kind of inquiry doesn't really reveal the whole movement of anger. It doesn't reveal the psychological roots of anger, not that particular anger, but the psychological roots of the violence which says, I must protect myself. To have that kind of insight into the roots of one's violence or into the roots of one's desire, a very different approach is needed. And that approach is an act of observation where you're not trying to label, where you're not trying to immediately create a picture of what you're observing. When you don't do that, I think that which you are observing can reveal itself in its fullness. And without that revealing itself completely, there can really be no clarity about its nature, and therefore there cannot be freedom from that activity. Therefore, it seems to me that while we help our children learn skills, learn to analyze, learn to have a sophisticated way of using concepts and ideas, it's far more important to bring in the children this capacity to just observe, to just listen. That word just seems to be very weak and incapable of doing anything. But in that just observing, just listening, there may be a tremendous vitality. And it may be that vitality which frees the mind from the patterns of psychological activity, and not any kind of control, not any kind of decision to be free. Right? So, very simply, it's worthwhile asking ourselves whether a totally different kind of education can come into being. And I have a feeling that at the end of such an education, the child who goes out of such a place will have a very different quality of intelligence, an intelligence which can meet society and not become part of it, which can meet the contradictory movements of society and not just get absorbed into it. That was Krishnamurti's concern with education, and that, it seems to me, is a very worthwhile intent to keep in mind and see if it can happen.